I'm Bill Auten of Auten Claims Management.
I'm Chantal Roberts of CMR Consulting, and welcome to the Art of Adjusting podcast.
Today, we're going to talk about life as an insurance adjuster from the perspective of property, auto, liability, or workers' compensation adjusters. Our goal is to bring interesting topics in the world of claims adjusting to people who are working as an adjuster now and to people who are considering a career as a claims adjuster.
Hey, Chantal. It's 2024, and we are rocking and rolling here with our next episode. And today we're going to be talking about unfair trade practices, and unfair claims handling.
Yes.
So,
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to all of our listeners. Yes. And the, as we call them, the UTPA, the Unfair Trade Practices Act, or Unfair Claims Settlement, or if you want to just talk the lingo, bad faith, whatever, good faith claims handling, bad faith claims handling, whatever. They're all the same, except one's slightly more legal than the other if you were ever to be in a deposition. But anyway, it's a subject that is near and dear to my heart because, and if you've been following the art of adjusting at any point in time, you know that you and I start the new year by going over these things because it is my fervent hope that I put myself out of business as an expert witness for claims handling standards, practices, and procedures. There you go. Happy New Year.
And the CPCU Society has an ethics month, and I can't remember which month it is. It's not January, I don't believe.
I think it's May.
But during that ethics month, they do touch on a lot of the topics that we're going to be talking about here in January. So why do we talk about this topic as claims people?
The first reason, of course, is that it helps keep us as adjusters out of trouble when handling our claims. And the second reason, and I think that this would be more, I guess, self-centered-ish or selfish, whatever, would be that it would help us handle our claims quickly and efficiently. And if we can handle our claims more quickly, if that's a word, more efficiently, then that's definitely what we want to do.
Got it. Because quickly is definitely a word, by the way. I checked.
Well, I know. I was thinking more quickly. Is more quick?
More quicker?
I don't know. Anyway,
more quick, faster.
Yeah,
we'll just say faster.
You know who's going to tell us is BCAB, who still listens to us.
Good.
Now that we've made the jump, and so BCAB, be sure to write in the comments how we are wrong, and there you go. He will shoot us an email or something.
Our grammar corrector.
Yes, our grammar corrector.
So aside from getting in trouble grammatically, how do adjusters get into trouble, and what kind of trouble does adhering to the UTPA, what kind of trouble does that get us out of?
It can stop us from getting those bad faith lawsuits. Well, I say it can stop us from getting those bad faith lawsuits. I think that everybody will always sue for any reason whatsoever. There's probably no reason why we could ultimately say there's never going to be another lawsuit, but it definitely doesn't help the insured, or in the case of a direct action state like Louisiana, for example, the claimant, where they can file suit for bad faith, especially if we're operating within the guidelines of the state and the guidelines of our company. And of course, the caveat is that every company is different and every state is going to be different. We're going to talk about, and I've always talked about, the quote model laws or model acts, end of quote, that the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, NAIC, put together. And they've basically been codified in every, state. But every once in a while, there's a little change here and there. And
so if I can kind of reel you back a little bit And
Sure.
just there's two things I want to ask about. One is how a first year adjuster needs to be aware of the problems that can happen and aware of what a bad faith action against the company actually is. Because I don't think a lot of people understand that their actions constitute the behavior of the insurance company. And if they're deemed to be a bad actor through that adjuster's actions, then the insurance company then has to answer for that. So as a young adjuster, what do you got to look out for?
This is a great question, Bill, and I'm so glad that you've asked me it. I also facilitate CPCU 530, which is applying uh, legal concepts to insurance. When I took it, it was just insurance law. But regardless, what they talk about in CPCU 530 is something that every adjuster should be aware of, is that you as an adjuster are an agent of the insurance company. Now, when I say agent, I mean representative, and not the agent that sells insurance like a producer. And so this is something that I think is kind of lacking in our teaching of our adjusters nowadays. So when you say something as an adjuster, you are representing the insurance company. And so when you say, don't worry about it, it's going to be covered, and it's not covered, and you don't tell the insured later, oh, I'm sorry, I've made a mistake, let me write a reservation of rights letter, which is a whole different podcast or something to that effect, then this is what leads to bad faith. If you don't follow some of these prescribed guidelines, for example, one of the very first ones is explaining every kind of policy benefit that the insured could have. For example, and sometimes they use the word claimant, so that could be third party claimant as well. Although you don't have to tell a third party claimant policy limits or whatever, you just have to know your state. I'm thinking of California, for example. But you need to say, hey, Mr. Insured, you not only have these limits, but you also have debris removal, which is 10%, blah, 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 up to a sublimit of yada, 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 or whatever. And not doing this could be a violation of the bad faith claims handling or the Unfair Trade Practices Act or the Unfair Claim Settlement Practices Act. So as a new adjuster, in short, knowing these rules and guidelines, which are, like I said, most of the time codified, meaning that they're laws in that state, will help you get out of trouble. And if you need to know what those laws are, anticipating maybe your next question, Bill, I don't know if I am or not, but it would be to just Google unfair claim settlement practices for whatever state that you're in, and read that. They're almost all the same.
And how would you describe Unfair Claims Practices Act laws as if I were a 5-year-old? So, and the reason I ask is I've read them. I think I know them pretty well, but they're not, they don't roll off the tongue. I can't sit here
No,
and quote them to you verbatim, but I do
right.
have a sense of the spirit of those laws. So what would you recommend as a general guide to adjusters that would keep them kind of on track?
Sure. Because you're right. There's like 14 of these Unfair Trade Practices Act, and trying to and of course attorneys uh, and regulators have written them, so they're very verbose and wordy. So I think I would remember that there's basically 4 parts, and the first one comes down to policy and misrepresenting your policy. So be sure you tell the insured about the policy. Failing to work the claim, investigate the claim promptly. And promptly, of course, isn't defined, but it doesn't mean weeks and weeks and weeks. Failing to acknowledge or respond to some communications is like the third one. And the fourth one, again, would be refusing to pay a claim without any kind of investigation, which, by the way, we did kind of get into a little bit of a trouble when we had those pandemic business interruption claims. So a lot of people were simply reading the policy, seeing that there was a virus exclusion, and immediately sending out denials without doing an investigation.
Right.
That is indicative of a bad faith investigation, because you didn't do an investigation. There could be another reason why the place was shut down. Um, so I
So
hope
can I
maybe
ask
that,
another question on that
or
topic?
I don't know if I explained it like a 5-year-old, that I went to a 5-year-old though. You've got your classroom rules, you got to follow them,
There you
and
go.
yeah, there you go. You got to talk to people. You have to work with people. Um, you have to tell them why you're doing something. Like, teacher, I got to go to the bathroom. You just don't get up and leave the room. So you got to tell people what you're doing, and you can't refuse to just sit in the corner by yourself and not play with people. So yeah,
Yep.
maybe that's how you do it.
If I could boil it down, I would say that the first one relating to misrepresentation of the policy is just be honest about what the policy says or what it doesn't say. The second one is failing to adopt and implement reasonable standards for the prompt investigation. That just means do your job quickly and efficiently and make sure that you are not falling behind. And if you are, talk to your supervisor to rectify that if you need to.
Yep. Yep.
Uh,
Yep.
Third is, again, it's a matter of promptness and being on top of your workload and managing it properly and not letting things get away from you, your diaries and things like that. We call them tasks here. Make sure that your task list is up to date and current, and that you're returning your phone calls. And then the last one is refusing to pay claims. Don't refuse to pay claims unless you are positive that there is a reason to deny coverage to someone. So
Yeah.
that would be my approach to it. It's
I
still maybe a
think,
little more complicated for a 5-year-old
yeah,
might understand.
I think one of the things that I always told my adjusters when I was a claims manager is, one of the very first notes that I should see in a file is you reviewing the policy and listing out all of the policy facts and figures and all of that kind of stuff, so that I know that what the policy says. And then the second note that I should see as a claims manager is, I called the insured, I explained all the coverages to the insured, and they acknowledged. And that wording, explained the coverages and they acknowledged, would get you out of trouble, because by the time that a bad faith lawsuit has arrived, we're talking 2, maybe 3 years, depending on your statute, down the road, and people forget things. And the insured's going to forget that you've told them what they have available, but you have it in your file notes, that you've talked about it, and that y'all discussed it, and that they understood it. And as an expert witness, when I don't see that, I've got to take the insured's word for it that you didn't explain it to them.
Got it.
Yeah.
On the top, on the topic of bad faith, when you have a bad faith situation, again, for the new people and the 5-year-olds out there, the bad faith moniker or label simply means that the insurance company is not really living up to the promises that they made. Is that about in a nutshell what the bad
Yeah.
faith action would be?
Yeah.
So
I think that's perfect.
I have a question about your example with COVID, and you could take pretty much any other exclusion on the policy, like flood or
Sure.
anything. When a claim comes in, And let's say just based on the loss notice, the description in the loss notice, the adjuster knows that this is not a covered claim and fails to do an investigation and fires off a disclaimer letter. Is that in itself bad faith? Or is it only bad faith if that adjuster got it wrong because they didn't do the investigation? In other words, let's say it really wasn't the covered cause of loss. It really was, let's say, a flood that it would not be covered under a homeowner's policy. Again, is it bad faith if there really is no coverage?
That's a great question. And I love this question because it tends to have a lot of debate capabilities of it. And this is where the insurance nerd in me gets to come out and play both sides of the fence, so to speak. So I think in my viewing of how insurance quote should be end quote, our job is as a financial backstop to the policyholder. You know, we forget that. We forget that our job is to pay claims, actually, not to deny claims. That is our job. Our job is to pay claims. And so we should be looking for coverage, not looking for exclusions. Now, all of that being said, of course, there are exclusions. There are some things that just cannot be covered, period. Okay, moving on from that thought. If an adjuster automatically sends out a denial or disclaimer of coverage letter, is that bad faith? I'm going to say probably, because what happens if I don't know, a pipe burst, and that's what caused the quote unquote flood. And you have to understand, when speaking with lay people, they may use the word flood. And so they may have told their producer or their broker that my house is flooded. But what they mean is my sump pump has stopped working and it's backed up. And now I've got 2 inches of water in my basement. Well, there might be coverage for that. They may have a backup of, you know, plumbing endorsements.
Or if a pipe bursts on the second floor and floods the
Exactly.
house from above, that would be covered. That's accidental discharge.
Right. You
Um,
even use the word flooding, and we are adjusters and we know not
right.
to use the word flooding, you know. And so the thing is we have to, as adjusters, pay attention to the vernacular talk of our insureds. And so if I were to just look at the Accord loss notice, or we never see those anymore, but our computer screen, you know, first notice of loss computer screen, and it says house flooded, and pop out a disclaimer of coverage letter, that might be bad faith because we didn't even do an investigation. We haven't called the insured. We haven't done anything, when it could be something else. And that's why that like fifth rule, quote unquote, or guideline, which is, you know, you need to do a prompt investigation, and you're refusing to pay claims without an investigation. You keep hearing that word investigation. That's why
Right.
that's so important. Now, here's the other thing that I would say would be a reason why this might be quote unquote bad faith claims handling, is that there's wording in almost all of the codified languages in all 50 states and our territories, and this sort of thing, that says something to the effect of, you as the insurer do this often enough to become a pattern of practice. And if all of the adjusters are doing this because it's come down on high that COVID isn't covered or that flooding isn't covered or whatever, then automatically send out that disclaimer of coverage, then that could be your pattern of practice of bad faith. And yes, that could be bad faith. Now, what should you do in this example of the flooding, or quote unquote flooding, is, of course, review your policy and then talk to your insured, find out what happened. You might find that, again, they're still going to use the word flooding because they're not insurance specialists, right? So say, okay, it sounds like what you've got is a burst pipe, but I'm hearing the word flooding. Flooding is not covered under your policy. Then you should send out what we call a reservation of rights letter. I think New York is slightly different. You call it
Not on first property.
Okay, okay.
Not on first party, rather.
Right. So again, I'm just going to say know your state, but a reservation of rights letter, which states you said that you had flooding. Flooding may not be covered. You're not denying it. May not be covered. Put the wording in there that says where flooding is not covered, and then say, I'm going to send out an independent appraiser, or I'm going to send out a guy from or a gal from our appraisal service or field investigator, whatever, and take pictures and see if it is a burst pipe or if it is actually flooding, like the whole neighborhood flooded. Well, then you've got
Yeah.
maybe a flooding thing.
I have 3 scenarios for you to talk a little bit about in 3 loss notice reports. And you can comment on the similarities and the differences, and then how the level of importance that the investigation poses for each of these scenarios.
Sure.
The first one is going to be very simple loss notices on a homeowner's policy that says insured's home flooded over the weekend. Okay. Second one says that the insured's home was damaged when the neighboring creek overflowed. Okay. And the third one said insured's home was washed off the hill by a torrential flood. So those 3 scenarios. In the first one, I would say you definitely need to dig deeper, find out what kind of flood this is, because you have very little information. The second scenario, you have more information, but I would say you still don't have enough. You still need to make a call and find out what is going on there. Did the bank overflow? And like you say, maybe it caused their sump pump to fail and that they have sump pump backup coverage. You need to investigate that further. The third scenario, you'd still need to make the call and talk to the insured. If nothing else, you need to be the face of the insurance company, showing some empathy and getting more information to make sure that this actually is a situation that probably isn't covered under a standard homeowner's policy. But you can see how, especially for a busy adjuster, when you get those 3 scenarios, that last one really doesn't sound like that would be covered at all.
Right.
But it's still worthy of a call. And however, if a disclaimer was issued on that last one, I think the likelihood that a bad faith action would come about would be lower than maybe on the first one.
Yeah.
So that's my take on those 3 scenarios. What do you say?
I totally agree. And what some people may not know is my husband is also an adjuster. And he often comes to me for pre-claims advice. But one of the things that he tells me about is that some of his younger adjusters will just settle a claim without ever picking up the phone and calling the insured, or sending out a letter for settlement without calling the insured, explaining how this is all going to be covered and not covered or whatever. And all I can do is just cringe and silently beg him to put me forward to train these adjusters so that they don't get bad faith. Because I think the thing that's going to make an insured angry is not hearing from someone, and the fact that you don't care.
Right.
Their home is now gone, or maybe they've got mud and debris or whatever 2 feet up into their house, or maybe they have black water from sewage up in their house or something like that. And the only thing is, I don't know, 3 days later, 3 weeks later, who knows what, haven't heard a thing. And all of a sudden they get a letter or an email and it says this isn't covered. No explanation why. If they try to call being the insured, if the insured tries to call you, the adjuster, they can't reach you because you hide behind voicemail, because you don't want to get yelled at. Heck, who does, man? Nobody wants to get yelled at. I don't want to get
No.
yelled at, but
comes with the territory though, doesn't it?
it does. It does come with the territory. And that's again, whole nother podcast, future date. We are going to talk about that. I would say you still need to at least send out a field inspector, investigator, appraiser, I call them appraisers, to at least take a look at the house that slid off the hill due to mudslides and earth movements. Just on the weird off chance that it's something else that's covered,
Right.
just on the weird off chance that it's covered. I have no idea what it could be, but
I
there
just
you
made
go.
them up, so.
I know, I know, but I mean, it's a very good example.
Yeah,
I mean,
because it demonstrates the different spectrums of severity and potential coverage issues that you would have among three similar claims. And in fact, that first loss notice could have been the house that was washed off the hill.
right.
Based on the wording, you just don't know. So it begs that you will have to do a proper investigation in all three of those scenarios, I would say.
The other word that you will hear that the insured uses quite a bit, but means different things to insurance personnel, like adjusters, is collapse. My ceiling collapsed.
Yeah.
And of course, collapse may or may not be covered, depending on what policy you have. And one of the best questions I have found to ask an insured is, okay, I'm sorry, are you in a safe space? I don't want you to be standing in a home where the roof has collapsed so that it continues to collapse on you. But can you see daylight? If you were standing under it, could you see daylight? No, it's only sagging. Okay, that's a word that I need. Sagging, not collapsing. That
Right.
will help me a little bit more. And then again, I can't stress it enough. You got to send out that reservation of rights letter, because again, what we just talked about at the very, very beginning of the claim, or this podcast, is how the adjuster is a representative of the insurance company, and you as the adjuster do not want to lead the insured or claimant down the garden rose path thinking that there's coverage. You need to be forthright with them and say, hey, look, I don't think there's going to be coverage here. I'm going to send you a letter. It's called a reservation of rights letter. You explain that. You send the letter out. Say, if you got any questions, feel free to call me. But what that does is it puts the insured on clear notice that there may not be coverage while you continue to investigate. So they, as the insured, should not be sitting there looking for you to pay for things. They should be taking care of things themselves.
Mitigating additional damages for sure.
Yes. And this is, I think, a lot of the reason why we have these bad faith lawsuits is that these adjusters are not talking to their insureds saying, hey, we may have a problem here. And the insureds are waiting, thinking that, quote unquote, everything is covered, end of quote. And they don't understand why it's not. And these Unfair Trade Practices Act is supposed to help with that.
Well, I wonder if we could switch gears a little bit and address liability claims in bad
Sure.
faith. So there's two aspects that I see. One, the most, I guess, important is when there are coverage issues and a claim is denied for coverage to a policyholder incorrectly or abruptly without the adjuster knowing all the facts. I would say that coverage issues in third-party liability claims are probably a bit more complex than those involved in property claims. Maybe not. You could probably argue both ways, but the point is that they are complex, and you can't make a coverage decision quickly sometimes, although in New York we're really required to. And it puts us in a tough spot because we have to evaluate the claim very quickly make that coverage decision and issue the coverage denial if there's no coverage quickly. And we may later find out that there actually is coverage. So where does a bad faith accusation fall under a scenario like that?
That's a great question. I'll give you an example of one as an expert witness, and this was a wrongful death claim. And in this particular instance, the claimant, deceased, the family, the widow was able to step in the shoes of the insured and sue the insurance company in the place of the insured because they had already gotten a verdict, a huge verdict in the millions. And so that's one of the things that you need to be looking at. But let me back up just a little bit. First and foremost, one of the things, and I know this is going to sound silly, I feel silly saying it now, being where I am, but I make sure that I explain it to my risk management students and to everybody that I talk to now, because I don't know if I understood it until I was about 10 years into the insurance industry. And that is, when you're talking about property damage claims, you really only have to determine if there's coverage. Is there coverage, yes or no? And then you go from there. If it's a no, you send out your disclaimer letter, your denial letter, whatever. If it's yes, you pay it. If it's a yes and no, you send out a partial denial and a partial payment. I mean, it's a binary kind of thing. With your liability, and so many people do not understand this, including lay people, there's actually two tests that you would have to take. You take your coverage test, which is still the same. Is there coverage? Yes or no? And then you go on to, is there liability? Is the insured responsible for this? Is the insured legally liable? Yes or no? And what took me a while to figure out is it is perfectly possible for the insured to have coverage but not be liable. And that's what we usually see. And so you would deny the claim to the third party claimant.
And that's a liability denial as opposed
Yes,
to a coverage
a
disclaimer
coverage.
or coverage
Exactly.
denial.
Exactly. There are times when the insured is liable, responsible for the accident, but there is no coverage. And this is not really so much common. I mean, that we usually see in a residential or personal lines kind of deal. I think my personal opinion, I saw it more in commercial than anything else. But this is when you then have to deny coverage to the insured and then turn right back around and tell the third party claimant, hey, there is no coverage for this. And that's confusing for the third party claimant because they know that the insured is at fault, and then they don't understand why you aren't paying.
Well,
and
we have to be very good at explaining that in our coverage
yes,
disclaimer, because if they don't understand it, it's because they wouldn't have read the letter, because the letter would contain a very detailed explanation of why that coverage doesn't exist. On a
yes,
homeowner's policy, the biggest coverage issue that we do see on liability, third-party liability claims, is usually when that homeowner has maybe a second home or moves out and rents the home and doesn't update their policy to say that this is now a rental property. There's a residency requirement in most homeowners policies, and that's one of the things that we see most for homeowners policies, where there is no coverage. There may be liability. They may have done something bad. They may have had a rickety set of stairs that they knew was bad and they didn't do anything about it or whatever, and somebody got hurt. But those situations, you're right, we have to disclaim coverage to both, and we have to send that letter to both the policyholder and the claimant or their attorney to inform them that there's no coverage. And again, New York has that tight timeline where we got to do that quickly.
right.
As opposed to saying, look, we have coverage, Mr. Insured, and we're going to defend you. if this goes to suit, because that's part of your coverage.
Mhm.
But if it's found that there's no liability here, we're not going to pay the claimant on your behalf because there's no need to. There's no
Right.
damages that you owe.
Most people understand that. So
Mhm.
let me go back to the original question, which is, you know, I was using this wrongful death case and bad faith and this sort of thing. In this particular instance, the adjuster never reached out to the claimant's widow and only took the insured's statement and then the statements for the witnesses as listed on the police report. Later on, the police officer contacted the adjuster and stated, I can prove that the witnesses did not see what they're telling you they saw. And the adjuster ignored this information. So as an adjuster, when you're talking about third party or liability claims, you still need to, I mean, you may have already denied that claim like they did in this particular instance. But if the police officer comes back to you after that denial and says, I can prove that these claimants or these witnesses didn't see what they saw, you need to reopen the file and look at it again. This adjuster also went to the manager, which they're supposed to do, and said, hey, you know, there's no property damage. It was an automobile accident, of course. There's no property coverage on this car. So they didn't look at the car. You know, that is probably wrong because that damage would support the insured's or the claimant's version of the facts. They didn't look at the bicycle. It was a collision with the bicycle in the car. And again, when they're reopening it, that's when you need to be taking a look at what things did I miss in my first go around that I need to do in my second go around. And that is when you get in trouble with a bad faith and a liability claim. So if you
So
do
that
have to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so that talks about the problems that you have with coverage. But what about on liability only? Let's say you have coverage and you've examined the policy, you've got coverage, and the adjuster makes a bad call on liability. Is there potential for bad faith against a carrier when an adjuster makes a bad call on liability?
I don't think so. I mean, not as much. You do have certain states, they're called direct action states. Louisiana happens to be the one that I'm most familiar with, where a third party can sue the carrier directly. And so you do have to be aware of any kind of bad faith actions. But here's what I would encourage all of our liability adjusters to do. If you're following the Unfair Trade Practices Act, then you should be fine. You know, answering the correspondence in a timely fashion, letting the insured and claimant know what the status is of a file, if there's anything that you need in regards to helping you make a decision. I mean, we're allowed. Oh, I keep talking about how, oh, if you do this or you don't do this, you're in bad faith or whatever. We're human, and the courts realize that we make mistakes. Amazingly, you know, adjusters make mistakes, but so it is okay for you as an adjuster when you're making a liability decision to make a liability mistake. And there are certain carriers that'll go unnamed that if the insured says, I didn't do it, I am not at fault, by goodness gracious, that carrier, even if they have a preponderance of evidence that their insured did do it, it's their policy to stand by their insured.
I
And
think I think there's almost a rule of freedom of speech that applies to liability decisions made by a carrier. I think they have the latitude to make make a determination that there's zero liability or very little liability, and offer a very tiny sum that that may be, offensive to a claimant's attorney. They do have the, like I say, latitude to be able to do that, and not be subject to bad faith action if they can explain why they're doing what they're doing.
Mhm. I
Um,
think that's the key point, if they can explain it,
right.
because
And even if their explanation is bad, let's say, here's where the freedom of speech theory applies. They are free to take that position, but they also have to understand the consequences. That's probably going to drive the matter into a lawsuit. That and you may wind up paying a lot in legal fees that you could have avoided by evaluating it properly at the outset.
right. And here's, I think, something for our liability adjusters to know and understand, because this is the way that I view it. Again, our job as the insurance company is to protect our insured, to be the financial backstop for our insured. We are to pay for what the insured is legally liable for. And if we, as adjusters, start dilly-dallying around with uh, liability and not accepting it just because we can be mean, or lowballing just because we can, or whatever, we are endangering our insureds. So we need to take that second step, and maybe even that third step, and not immediately look at what we're doing to the third party claimant, who will file suit, but they won't necessarily file suit against us as the carrier unless they're in a direct action state. What they'll do is they'll file suit against the insured. And in my case, what happened is the claimant filed suit against the insured. The insured threw up her hands, said no contest. And then the claimant stepped in the shoes of the insured and then sued the carrier for bad faith. And this is how, this is like the third step or the second step. So as a liability adjuster, what I'm saying is, think about what the second and third steps are. Yeah, you can absolutely say, I'm not going to accept liability for this, or you're 50% liable, I'm only going to pay 50 cents on the dollar, or whatever. But um, is that going to endanger your insured? And a lawsuit's going to be filed, and there's all the next steps. And then the insured can turn right back around and say to you, you as the carrier did not settle this claim that you knew or should have known was going to go into a lawsuit, be a policy limits case, whatever. And therefore you acted in bad faith by not protecting me.
Right. So that's why I say this is analogous to the free speech theory, because
Mhm.
you can say what you want. You can have the latitude to make a liability decision and make a settlement offer, but if you're doing that um, in a way that's not exactly prudent, then you will
Right.
suffer the consequences. But more importantly, you are actually placing your insured at potential risk, especially if you've got a catastrophic injury and the limits are very low. You may be putting that policyholder in a position where there's a verdict in excess of the policy limits, and then they become personally liable to pay the remaining damages. So if you have $100,000 policy, let's say, and you've got $1 million injury, and you have an opportunity to settle that within the policy limits as a
Exactly.
carrier, and you fail to do that, and then the policyholder gets hit with $1 million verdict, you're setting yourself up for a bad faith situation there. And I think
Absolutely.
that's probably the best example of a situation where a decision on liability and damages could have a bad faith repercussion.
Absolutely. And that's what happened with my instance. I think I've probably talked about everything that I find really important. Communication, communication, communication is the big deal. Um, and in fact, speaking of communication, in 2 weeks we're going to be talking about more communication with recorded statements. I'd like to talk about some recorded statement.
That's great. I think that's an important topic for all new adjusters out there. And yeah, I think you're right. Communication is hugely important when it comes to avoiding bad faith, but I think it also you also have to be very fair and honest in your dealings with policyholders and claimants to avoid bad faith situations. So yeah, looking forward to the statements episode.
Yeah, it should be fun. So
Great.
be sure to like and subscribe, make some comments below. I know Brandon will tell us if more quickly is bad. So please do. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
You bet. Take care.
Thanks for joining us on the Art of Adjusting podcast, where we talk about life as an insurance adjuster.
If you enjoyed this podcast or this episode, please give us 5 stars and a review. It does help the algorithm pick us up.
Hit that subscribe button real quick and tell all of your adjuster friends to check this out as well. For independent adjusting services, go to www.autin.claims. And for anyone interested in working as an independent liability adjuster, go to the Contact Us tab to join our roster.
In the meantime, you can contact me at theartofadjusting.com for consulting and training purposes.